UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Weird. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and this is our inaugural episode. Unfortunately, I'm flying solo today, though, as my co-host Jen Durrell couldn't make it to record, but she'll be here next week, and then I think what we'll do is delve into some of her many experiences of the paranormal, and also get a feeling of what she thinks about the topic, because that's what I want this show to be about, and I know Jen does as well. I want it to be a conversational show where ideas are explored more than just a hard interview show. Anyway, seeing as I'm hosting the show solo today, I thought it might be fun to bring on a guest who I suspected would tease out some of my own ideas. I have a very keen interest in the thinking of UFO authors like John Keel and Jacques Vallee, and I knew that this researcher did as well. So, without any further ado, let's jump straight into the interview. My guest today is the ex-head of the Wisconsin chapter of MUFON, a weird fiction and horror author, and one of the most insightful and thoughtful researchers working in the broader Fortean field today. She's also the host of her own fascinating podcast, Just Another Tinfoil Hat, which can be found at justanothertinfoilhat.com. I think it's probably a good idea for you to strap on your own tinfoil hat, because we're about to jump straight into the bottomless rabbit hole of UFO belief with Zelia Edgar. We were talking about Keel and the X-Files and how Jose Chung's from outer space. You were saying, and you might want to just say it again now we're actually having an audience listening to us. You were saying how that episode in season 3 is such a wonderful, wonderful representation of some of the highest strangeness, I guess, in John Keel's work.
Oh yeah, that episode in particular is actually one of my all-time favorite episodes, and that is, that's saying something because I love The X-Files. It's one of my all-time favorite shows, and that is seriously one of the best. It's a perfect spoof of Keel's research, and it was to the point where it was so dead on and so perfect that I watched this show with my younger sister, and I actually had to pause the episode 5 or 6 times while we were watching because I was just laughing so hard at these different portions of the show. She was like, "What's your problem?" Like, no, you wouldn't get this. This is like straight out of the Mothman prophecies. And it's not just that episode either. I mean, that one used this, the high strangeness in Keel's research in a very, hilarious light. But there are also a lot of other episodes where it's obvious someone really did their research, who was writing the show. I mean, so many have the same themes and tones of a lot of these really good researchers, but Keel comes through a lot throughout the X-Files.
The episodes I enjoy the most are those which have that uncertainty. So obviously the Jose Chung episode we were talking about, but there's an episode, I think it's around season 6 or 7 or maybe later, where Mulder is in contact with somebody from, the deep state, I guess. And he almost convinces Mulder that this was all just government technology and government spin. And it's such a wonderful episode. And I've always thought, imagine if the X-Files actually spun on a dime there. Because you're watching that. It's a 2-parter, I remember. I'm going, my goodness, are they really going to go there? Are they going to really have that this is all just, all just deep state spin? And you travel with it for a while, which is fantastic, I think.
See, I remember that episode very well. And I was watching through the X-Files like the first time, episode by episode, around the same time that I was reading John Keel's work for the first time. So like about 16, 17, I think was when that was. And I hit that episode. And see, before that, I was very much like, I've been interested in the paranormal since I was a kid. And, I came at it from a very separate standpoint that, cryptids are undiscovered creatures, UFOs are from outer space, they're from space aliens, ghosts are spirits of the deceased or whatever. And so I hit both of these things at the same time. And that particular, it was a 2-parter. It actually made me question everything. Because of course I was, alien abductions, that's pretty much proof of the extraterrestrial agenda. And all of a sudden that episode hit and I was reading Keel and I was just like, whoa, I actually had to take like a little bit of time and kind of reorganize. So yeah, I remember that episode very, very well. And I think some people actually subscribe to that theory that the alien abduction phenomenon is a massive cover-up for the government, but I don't know what to make of it.
And I think it's, as I mentioned, I think earlier when we weren't recording, Keel said belief is the enemy. And I think that's true when we look at any of the phenomena in a broader Fortean type map. But it's funny that you discovered Keel when you were watching the X-Files, because I discovered Keel in season 2 when I was visiting America, because I used to live in Australia. And I ended up watching the episode 1 of season 2 in a bar in Vegas, because who I was staying with didn't have cable. But then my trip finally took me to Atlanta. And it's one of those weird just coincidences, synchronicities that changes your entire life. The house I was staying in, somebody who'd been there before, I think they'd evicted them, because I met somebody in a bar and I ended up I always used to meet people in bars when I visited America, and ended up staying with them instead of hotels because I could pay, a smaller amount. Anyway, so that was a very big trip I had when I wasn't a resident of America. I was just visiting here. And, somebody had moved out, and they had all of their junk material, and they were going through it, and they pulled out a copy of the Mothman Prophecies. And I mean an old copy, like a circa 1970s copy. And the weirdest thing of all is when I saw the cover art, I remembered seeing the cover art at a friend's house when I was a little boy, like when I was 10 or 11. For some reason, the book was at his house, and I think it would have been way beyond any kid that age's comprehension. But I remember being spooked out by the cover art. And then I'm like, I saw this book, and I remember being spooked out over 10 years before. But that's how I got and that changed my life in many ways. The reason I ended up doing both my master's degree and my PhD dissertation in the history of UFOs is because I was already fascinated with the topic. And much like you were saying, I took the alien abduction narrative quite literally. I thought that, the broader extraterrestrial hypothesis I took quite literally. And I bought into a lot of those things, which in the 90s, pre-X-Files and going into the X-Files, was massive. The idea of, there being a literal saucer crash in Roswell in 47, that somehow the government knew about the ETs, were maybe in some kind of weird cahoots with them, and that abduction was happening on a mass scale. I'd read the type of papers that Bud Hopkins and who's the historian who worked with him? I should know. I'm a UFO historian. Jacobs had done together, where they'd done this poll. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it was to indicate if Americans had been abducted by aliens. And they had questions like, do you have any marks on your body that you can't remember? Do you have dreams of flying? Have you ever woken up paralyzed? And I remember when I read that poll, I'm like, tick, tick, tick. I'm like, my God, maybe I'm an abductee. And I had all these terrifying memories of when I was a little boy. I used to have this very vivid dream. This is probably going a little more personal than I would have wanted to. I don't normally speak publicly about this, but I had this very vivid dream of a little man coming and visiting me at night and taking me away to this very strange place where there were all these very tall figures. I know, creepy, right? All these very tall figures. And I still remember, I must have been about 4, but I remember one dream.
Yeah, no kidding.
Me thinking one was my mum and tugging on its leg, and then it bending down and looking at me, and its face was like, inches from me, and it was completely inhuman. Now, I today think that was probably just childhood night terrors, because I had night terrors as well. I'd wake up paralyzed and things when I was little. But I finally got rid of that little man. I remember it physically as much as I remember anything physically. I actually had a wrestling match with that little man. Like on my bed, I fought him, and then he went away and he never came back. But that could have been my psyche dealing with things. But my point is, when I read...
Oh, wow.
When I read that abduction checklist, it took me back to my childhood, and Whitley Strieber's The Cover Art of Communion was just so off-putting, and you read all the things coming out, particularly by Bud Hopkins, and the narratives were just terrifying. I think there was a TV adaptation with Richard Crenna of Intruders, one of Bud Hopkins' early important works, and so even in that period pre-X-Files, the increase in belief in abductions, and including the impact it had on me, really disturbed me, to be honest. But anyway, this is long story long now, not long story short, or short story long maybe. When I found Keel when I was in Atlanta and read that, a light went off on my head, and I'm like, I can look at this phenomenon from a non-literal stance, perhaps. And as a result of that, I then started my postgraduate academic work in the UFO phenomenon, because I knew I could look at the phenomenon by reading Keel and then Vallee and, Patrick Harper and other people like that. I knew I could look at the phenomenon and take it seriously, but that didn't mean you had to buy into the standard narrative which was very popular in UFO lore at the time, or UFO belief at the time, was that this is literal, and there's there's millions of Americans being abducted, and they're about to colonize us, and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how. Anyway, it was interesting that we had that parallel of discovering the X-Files and John Keel at almost the same time.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, that's a good point too, though, is that John Keel, I mean, he absolutely revolutionized how I looked at the paranormal in general. Like I said, this was like a lifelong interest of mine. And so to have that kind of epiphany was just, it was crazy. And especially to think too that so many of his works apparently were going out of print for quite some time, and they're now finally experiencing a comeback. And I think that that is so important because, like you mentioned, he was quoted as saying, "Belief is the enemy," and the way that for a long time the paranormal was really being led down a path of these separate fields, cryptozoology and spectrology and ufology, and all the parallels between these different fields. People really didn't want to look at that. And the truth is that these patterns exist between them and that they are incredibly important. And Keel definitely picked up on that. And I know a lot of other researchers, such as Vallee, did too. And it's that question of like, what is, this kind of blanket, the unexplained, that's really important. And before we can really start trying to understand it, we have to accept that these patterns exist.
Did you have any experiences yourself that led you to, on top of the X-Files and Keel, that led you into an interest in the broader Fortean phenomenon that we're talking about?
Like personal experiences?
Yeah.
Or
personal experiences, or seeing something, or
yeah, I guess so. It's kind of funny because I've been asked this question a few times on like various podcasts, and I never really think of it as anything important. But yeah, I've had kind of, I guess, more experiences than would be normal or typical. When I was a kid, and this is actually before I remembered, apparently when I was about 2 years old, I asked my mom what this light up ball was that was floating down the hallway. So that was like the first big one. And then two, I've had several experiences with UFOs. There was a very interesting sighting of orbs, which actually like 5 other people saw it with me right outside my house. And so stuff like that, I think too, see, I'm interested in how this phenomenon, whatever it is, why, yeah, certain people seem to experience things whereas others don't. Because too, my family, my mom's side of the family, uh, lived in a haunted house, quote unquote, shortly before I was born, and there was a lot of activity there. So, and I know Keel kind of studied this idea that maybe certain bloodlines have a higher tendency to experience certain things or not. But yeah, the interesting thing is, I'm not sure particularly if that is the reason why I'm interested. If it is, it's almost totally subconscious because, in a weird way, it's like I never connected the two. Like, okay, sure, I saw this thing in the sky I can't explain, or the house where I currently live has had some haunting type activity. But I've never connected that to, okay, yeah, when I was 8 years old, I wanted to get every book that there was on Bigfoot. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting that you say there are some people that might be genetically or bloodline or something predetermined. I know that Keel also talked about the fact that some people who were experiencers almost maybe had an umbrella effect on the people around them, that if you were somebody who was likely to have an experience, somebody else mightn't, but when they came into your field, they were. Who's going to be the normal co-host of the show with me, Jen Durrell, who's also my girlfriend, as a disclosure to the audience. She's somebody who has experiences. She's also a paranormal investigator. And I know she's told me when she's been near and with other people that they've seen things as well. So I think that, and as soon as she said that, I thought about Keel speaking about how maybe there is that weird umbrella effect in experiencing the paranormal. Is that anything you've been conscious of in your research? Because I know you've done field research, which fascinates me because I haven't. And I'm wondering if you've ever encountered that idea that somebody might be the center point of the phenomenon, and other people who are in their immediate physical circle then also experience things when they're with that person.
I have definitely heard of that theory throughout my research mainly. It's nothing I've come into personal contact with, though. It's kind of, actually, it is kind of funny because So, of course, no matter who I talk to, I'm always like, hey, have you ever seen a UFO? That's kind of like my opening icebreaker, which I'm not sure if it's a very good one, but usually makes for interesting conversation. And the funny thing is that there's a good friend of mine that I met at my day job, work at a cafe, and I don't know if it is something that she just didn't notice until now, but after we became friends, she started having, you know, I guess you would classify them paranormal type experiences, just little things every now and again. So that would be the only personal experience I have with that. As to whether, again, if it's coincidence, which I usually hate that word, I don't know. Um, but yeah, I do come across that in my research a lot, that some people are just kind of like the focal point for this for whatever reason. But have you ever had any personal experiences while we're on the topic?
Yeah, this is again something I don't talk a lot about, but I have. When I was little, our family home, and I remember it really creeped me out. We had, I think, a general handyman kind of guy come around. I can't even remember what he was repairing, but he used to come quite regularly to fix things. My father could have. My late father was actually an engineer in the Navy, and then he became an officer, and then he went into, so he was quite handy anyway, but he was always busy and working. He'd started some computer businesses. So we had, I think, a handyman come and fix things. Anyway, I remember very clearly him telling my mother that he was like a psychic, or, had these feelings, and something or someone was buried beneath our house, which isn't what you want to hear when you're a little kid. So I'm not sure how much
Oh,
that,
wow.
I know, impacted me as well. But I remember when I was little, on top of this kind of sleep paralysis stories I was telling you, I remember hearing footsteps in our house and there being nobody there. And as I got older and into my teens, I dabbled with the occult, which I certainly wouldn't recommend people dabbling in. There are doors you can open and they're very hard to close. Again, this is something Keel talked about, like people who investigated UFOs or were involved in the occult would sometimes be so haunted by things that they'd almost lose their minds. And Keel would say, just burn everything and don't look at it anymore, and this stuff will leave you. So whatever it is, whether it's psychological or something else. But anyway, so I dabbled in the occult a little when I was in my teens. When I say that, I mean mainly things like Ouija boards, which I did when I was even younger, and I was interested in tarot and those kinds of things. I probably did some other silly occulty things when I was a teen, as some people do and probably shouldn't. But I had some frightening experiences when I was that age. Things where I thought there was. Now looking at it in a more kind of Keelian or even more academic skeptical mode, whether that was, I don't think it was me just imagining things, because it was far more physical than that, but whether it was me already in that kind of mindset and then transposing that onto some kind of external phenomenon, or whether it was a Jungian type thing where I was somehow externalizing the things I was thinking about, I'm not sure, but I certainly mainly heard and saw evidence of things which disturbed me when I was in my teens and actually stopped me fooling around with a lot of that stuff. So again, it's psychological. I don't know the explanation, but I certainly learned that there was probably more, that's in heaven and earth and's dreamt of in your philosophy, to quote Shakespeare. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. See, and that brings up kind of an interesting point too, though, is I feel like a lot of the time someone who is looking at this on either side of the fence, from believability or, true like dogmatic skepticism, a lot of the times there's this subjective nature to experiences. And when that's brought up, a lot of the times, the believers don't really want to deal with it because it makes them look unprofessional. The skeptics don't want to deal with it because they believe if it's a subjective experience, it can't be proven. What do you think of that concept? Because that is popping up time and time again, especially I'm really focusing on UFO encounters with occupants. And there are so many accounts that are just kind of, you have multiple witnesses and they see slightly different things. Personally, I feel like this phenomenon is really tied to the observer somehow. So I was just wondering what your take on that was.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. And it's something which probably was an underlying part of the academic research that I did, both in my master's and particularly in my PhD. And I say this with the caveat that John Keel said there's because we're talking about Keel all the time today, that he said there's no authority on UFOs. So I'm not an authority, even though I spent a lot of time studying them. I certainly don't have a background in the hard physical sciences. My background is in the humanities, and particularly as an historian. But what I can say, to answer your question in a long roundabout way, is that it's undeniable that the UFO, and I would challenge anybody to actually prove me wrong on this, because you can't. It's undeniable that whatever the phenomenon is, it's culturally bound. So in the 1950s, if we just talk, this will narrow it down to the UFO phenomenon, the modern-ish UFO phenomenon for a moment. So post-1947 UFO phenomenon. If we go back to the 1950s, when people had contact encounters, whether they were the contactees like the George Adamskis and the Derenbergers and those kind of people, they often encountered human-like flying saucer pilots, for lack of a better term, and often they'd be reminiscent in many ways of some of the aliens in the movie. Certainly, The Day the Earth Stood Still would be a classic example where our main pilot is essentially a human for all intents and purposes. But there are also a lot of reports back then. The Hopkinsville Goblins would be a great example. Flatwoods Monster would be a great example. And there's plenty others of them. They're just famous ones. Where UFO experiencers or people who were encountering them, or whatever you want to call them, were seeing very different things. So the Flatwoods Monster is nothing like the Hopkinsville Goblins, which is nothing like George Adamski's Orthon, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, beautiful Swedish-looking Venusian. But my point is then the science fiction of the day also echoed that there were lots of different creatures. So sometimes they'd be humanoid-like, sometimes they'd be quite monstrous. We were still coming out of a period where the pulp magazines were very popular, with different interpretations of what alien life might look like. So you didn't get one type of extraterrestrial. If they are extraterrestrials, I don't think they are, but let's say for a minute they are. You didn't get one type of extraterrestrial. People seem to be seeing all kinds of different critters and creatures and identities and personalities. But if you flash forward to the 1990s, certainly the phenomenon, or the aspect of the phenomenon in its appearance that you read about most, whether you were reading a book by Bud Hopkins, or whether you were reading a book by Whitley Strieber, or whether you were reading just standard abductee reports, it had been popularized enough from probably the Betty and Barney Hill case onwards, and certainly by the time we got to Close Encounters, what these occupants were meant to look at. There was almost like the mass subconscious understood they were meant to be diminutive. They were meant to look almost like sickly children in some ways. They had big heads. They had weird eyes, normally big black eyes. And so all of the reports after that seem to be about grey extraterrestrials. Now, if you believe the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and I'm not criticizing you if you do, that's fine, but explain to me how prior to Betty and Barney Hill, and certainly prior to the popularization of what they saw, which became a network television movie, and a number of years later, and then let's segue from that all the way through Close Encounters, how come from the 80s into the 90s, abduction report after abduction report, or contact report after contact report, we're getting little grey men? But prior to that, people are explaining entirely different entities. So it seems to me that, to get back to your question about subjectivity, I think that hints to me, it proves to me that it's culturally bound, for one thing, but it hints to me that it must be, because of that, the way that it looks like it's culturally bound, it seems that definitely is subjectively bound, because the belief is attached to the culture. So, and I think you can look at that if you look at the broader history of UFO belief. When people who believe in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, again, I'm not criticizing people who do, but they have a different historical narrative to what happened than what actually happened if you just look at it as an historian. So let's start in 47. If somebody who believes in the standard modern extraterrestrial hypothesis is telling you the history of UFOs since 1947, they'll talk about maybe the Kenneth Arnold saucer sightings. They'll talk about which we'll get to that, the saucer sightings, because they weren't saucers at all. They'll talk about the Kenneth Arnold saucer sightings. They'll talk about the crash at Roswell, and then after that, it will segue into this narrative about how the U.S. government, got a dead alien and a crash saucer, and they started back engineering this technology in places like Area 51, and maybe they went into some kind of X-Files type, which of course the X-Files was based itself on an already pre-existent idea in ufology that the US government had deals with the extraterrestrials and knew what was going on and was keeping it from the public. And that's the standard narrative up until today. But if you go through the history of UFOs and actually read the books, when I say history of UFOs, I mean the history of people who were interested in UFOs and writing about UFOs and believing in UFOs. If you go through that history, Roswell disappears after 47. There's a UFO encyclopedia, and it's not the Jerome Clark multi-volume set, which is fantastic. It's a UFO encyclopedia. I think it was published in 1980. The major UFO reference book in the 1980s, written by somebody in the field. Roswell isn't mentioned in that book. So my point is, from 1947 to 1980,
really,
it was essentially forgotten. The Air Force came out and said, after the initial story, which we all hear, U.S. Army Air Force discover, crash saucer, which, was made headlines around the world. And then the Air Force retracted that story. And we could get into that as well and talk about whether it was a mogul weather balloon or whatever it was. But that story was retracted. But regardless of what actually happened at Roswell, my point is that UFO believers from 47 to 1980 essentially didn't even talk about the Roswell incident. But if you ask somebody now about the history of UFOs, it was important who's a UFO believer. It's important from the very beginning. And if we go to Kenneth Arnold, who I mentioned briefly, and almost everybody who's done any reading on the subject knows this, what Arnold saw wasn't flying saucers at all. When he was flying near Mount Rainier in, I think, June of 1947, he saw essentially delta-wing crafts. And I think a number of them, I can't remember how many there were. Let's say like a squadron or whatever you would call an assortment of military planes. He saw delta wing craft flying, and they moved, as he said in an initial interview, they moved like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. So the way we see a saucer or a stone move if we throw it across a pool, it hits the water, it bounces, hits the water and bounces. So he was describing the movement of the craft when he used the saucer word, not the shape of the craft, which he was always very clear about was delta wing type shape, or a bat wing type shape. There were different descriptions, but headline and copywriters picked up on the saucer bit and called them flying saucers. So what happened as soon as the main media of the day, which was newspapers, called them saucers, was that everybody started, when they were seeing things in the sky, not everybody, people still saw cigar-shaped craft and orb-shaped craft and whatever else, but the idea that stuck with the population around the world was that these things were flying saucers. But Arnold never saw a flying saucer. But somehow that description became so popular that then that's the way we think of extraterrestrial craft visiting this Earth, and it's certainly the way that Hollywood ran with it throughout the 1950s, whether we think about Earth versus the flying saucers, or whether we think about The Day the Earth Stood Still, or any of these movies, it's always a saucer or a disc-shaped craft that lands and, the little men get out and do whatever else. But that isn't what Arnold described. So how did a description that was misinterpreted by a copywriter become the way that these crafts were seen for essentially the next, 60, 70 years?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. This brings up, I know, one of your favorite books of Vallee's, and one of my personal favorites too, Messengers of Deception, which is, if anything, more a study of the belief systems about UFOs rather than a study of UFOs themselves, because it does appear that there is this give and take between popular opinion and culture and reports. And if this was simply an objective phenomenon, which is, again, the extraterrestrial hypothesis has a lot of support, and, if that's your belief system, by all means, I'm not trying to disrespect it. But if you are going with this hard and fast, there is a culture or several cultures from another planet coming here, do they take turns? Is there just suddenly, okay, they're looking for flying saucers, okay, the Saucerians can come in now. It really doesn't make sense that way, in my opinion.
No, I think your opinion's right. And again, I don't want to offend anybody's belief system. I certainly hope as the show evolves, I can have people of all kinds of different beliefs and be respectful. But I think when we talk about the broader phenomenon, and this ties in kind of to your point about different, are they taking turns and different people from different planets and star systems visiting us? But if we look at the Fortean model of measuring the circle starting anywhere, meaning the whole broader paranormal realm, or if we even look at a Vallee or a Keel type of way and just say, well, let's compare, reports from the Europe 15th century about fairies and current, UFO encounter reports, or whether you look at the similarities with, Bigfoot sometimes being seen with lights nearby, or there's so many, or if you look at the weird sulfuric smell which comes sometimes with a Bigfoot, sometimes with a ghost, sometimes with a demon, sometimes with an extraterrestrial. There's certainly lots of things which seem to have very similar phenomenon, but which some people would have us believe are entirely different phenomenon. But all of that aside for a minute, let's say all of this phenomenon is real. Let's say there are hairy man-apes walking the North American wilderness. And again, I'm not being derogatory of people who believe in Sasquatch, because I think there's something behind. Where there's smoke, there's fire. People are seeing something. Or whether we believe in UFOs landing from another planet and people coming out of those craft and talking to us or abducting us or whatever, or whether we believe in lake monsters in various lakes around the world, or whether we believe in Virgin Mary apparitions, or whatever we believe in, if we respect all those beliefs, and we should, but all of a sudden this world is filled with so many strange different phenomenon. If we look at it as if we imagine for a minute, it's all definitely different phenomenon. So all we need is one Loch Ness monster body, or one Bigfoot body, or one, solid extraterrestrial landing on the White House lawn, which people have been talking about since the 1950s, and still today they're saying disclosure's just around the corner. It's going to happen at any moment. All we need is one of these things to happen, and our entire universe changes. Now, I respect cryptozoology because we know there's been weird things found, like this coelacanth, which was meant to have died out long ago, and there's been other weird critters discovered. So there's probably more things on this planet than we're aware of. And I certainly, while my mind is skeptical, I like to keep it skeptical in a healthy way. I don't trust science as the arbiter of reality like a lot of people do, because we know that there are paradigm shifts, and we know what was true yesterday eventually starts to fall apart, and the scientists will jump on another bandwagon, and that theory will be true until there's enough cracks in it that it falls apart. So I'm not just saying, well, science can't show me these things. I'm saying that nobody can show me these things. All we need is one of those things I talked about to have real evidence of, and our entire way of looking at the world changes. But we don't get any hard evidence for any of those things. So I think that's another reason for us to start to think, well, do we trust the people who are seeing these things? I do. I trust most people who tell me a story. I don't think most of the people I've spoken to have lied to me. I think they've had some kind of experience. But if I take that experience at face value, the universe all of a sudden becomes so strange, which is fine, because I like the idea of it being strange, but it also seems that if it's that literal, then surely we should be able to have just one of them. Just give me evidence of one of them, and then maybe I'll park my Keelian or Vallean or Patrick Harper theory somewhere behind me. But there still isn't for any of the phenomenon we talk about. And the fact that, like you said, it's subject. It seems to be bound by subjective, by viewers' subjective experiences, and it seems to also be culturally bound, and it seems to have so many commonalities that we were talking about between Bigfoot and UFOs and Virgin Marys and ghosts and everything else. Then to me, it seems almost intellectually more sensible to step back and say, well, if all of those things are true, I mean, you just have to look at the reports, they're true, then maybe we should be looking at some bigger, broader fusion explanation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, the issue for me is, because Ivan Sanderson is actually another one of my favorite researchers. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised because I read Invisible Residents, which I feel is one of his earlier works. And it, very much focused on the idea, not even of biological UFO occupants, but also of biological UFOs, which I am very intrigued by as well. But when he came to the part about sightings of extraterrestrial biological entities, he propounded a theory for how it could work. And he literally, in this theoretical universe where all of these, as you were mentioning earlier, the Greys, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, the Flatwoods Monster, the Venusians, all of these are just different races in this kind of never-ending, space alien parade visiting Earth. And, the issue with this is that when you try and put such strong walls up between the different types of phenomenon, especially too, given the similarities, I mean, poltergeist flare-ups after someone spots a UFO or sees Bigfoot, if you try and put these strong walls up, then you are facing countless questions as opposed to just one very large question. And yeah, definitely not saying that this concept of, I really like the super spectrum idea, which of course is kind of Keel's propounded theory. I'm not saying it even accounts for all of it, but I think that there are connections that really can't be ignored, and that this is a very clear-cut theory which would kind of explain many of these different occurrences.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I like the superspectrum explanation or the terminology more than I like the ultra-terrestrial terminology, which Keel, I don't think invented, but used. In an interview, Keel once said that ultra-terrestrials in his writing were a literary device. And I think a lot of people have even literalized what was meant to be a non-literal term or explanation. So sometimes people talk about ultra-terrestrials like, well, they're actually just from another dimension, or they've been living here with us all the time, but they're still the creatures we're seeing, and I think that's an easy mistake to fall into, because I think we want to have it. Certainly if we take the phenomenon seriously, as clearly you do and I do, I think as human nature, we want to literalize it somehow. We want to imagine a portal opening in the woods. And if we don't believe Bigfoot lives here, we want to imagine a portal opening and Bigfoot steps out of it from another dimension for a little while. And why we can't find his body or we never capture him is because he steps back into that portal and disappears. Or if we don't accept that, extraterrestrials come from another planet, we go, well, they come from another dimension, that they segue through to us and then they visit us, but they go away again. So I think the super spectrum terminology is far more helpful in some ways than ultra-terrestrials, because the ultra-terrestrial terms run away with itself.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, you are correct in saying, too, that Keel didn't actually coin that term. I believe it was Ivan Sanderson as well, because, of course, they collaborated quite a bit. And that does kind of, my issue too with that is that once you really, once you give something a name, like you're saying, once you take it literally, the issue is that you think you have an explanation. So often a terminology is confused with an explanation and understanding. And, it's a similar way for, again, the hardcore, extraterrestrial theorists who say that fairy lore, oh, well, those are obviously extraterrestrials. And my issue with that is that I always wonder, in a couple hundred years, are we going to be laughed at for calling the phenomenon extraterrestrial? There's going to be a new terminology, and look at what those idiots were calling space aliens. Every time this reinvents itself, the old forms simply feel we're no closer to really understanding what's at its core.
No, I think that's excellent, and that idea that which goes far beyond my initial explanation before of 1947 ufology and on. You're right; those type of subjective interpretations go back so far, and they're always culturally bound. And it is funny because people do like to dig up those old reports, and the airship reports, which I know you're fascinated in, are a classic example of this, because people who believe in the ETH say, well, there was a UFO flap in America in 1896 and 1897, but you can't read most of those reports and say that people were misinterpreting extraterrestrials from, another planet. What they were seeing was what might have been science fiction. We use the term steampunk today, they didn't then, but steampunk type technology with inventors who said, oh, I'm flying to Cuba, or I've got my, my hidden base in the woods. So I know that you're fascinated with the airship at the moment, and that it's something that you're looking into. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more how you think what we were just talking about applies to that 1896, 1897 flap as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the reason I'm really intrigued by that particular portion of time is because, a lot of the times these trends seem to last a long time for how people view unexplained phenomenon. And, prior to the 1800s, you have a strong belief in the fairies, and so things in the sky are usually considered to be related to the fairy lore, or they're, religious, it's angels and demons and stuff like that. And of course, after that, you hit the 1900s, and it was the later 1900s, like you're saying, that people first started looking at the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But those are the two really strong frames of reference for sightings of things in the sky. And the intriguing thing to me about, the airship reports is that I feel like it's this, if the fairy lore and the UFO lore are two sides of the same coin as far as this phenomenon, I really feel like the airship and the belief system around that belief system in human inventors and human inventions, is kind of like the edge of the coin. And so that entire era is watching this flip. And that is my big interest in it, because the belief system was strong in the idea that someone somewhere, some miraculous inventor, had finally achieved the heavier than air flying machine. And that obviously, I mean, these things in the sky, I know there was, like you mentioned in one of your messages, there were a lot of exaggerations throughout the papers. There was also a core of genuine reports. And these reports are of things that are, again, much like our current UFOs, defying the laws of physics. There's no way that some sort of dirigible, which is what the people believed that it was, could have been maneuvering in this fashion. Yet that is exactly what they thought. And that's because at that point in time, technological marvel really was what everyone was expecting. Hitting the technological age, and the Industrial Revolution, of course, was at that time as well. And so that is exactly what was expected. And again, the phenomenon responded accordingly. So that is my main interest there, is that I feel like it's a very strong kind of lens for this reflection.
Oh, I think you're dead on. And one of the things, I can't remember the turn of phrase you just used, but the idea that they were expecting this kind of, aviation, miraculous age, and so hence the Great Airship. What fascinates me about those reports is they're mostly optimistic, and they're fun, and you said, I'm sure there was yellow journalism,
Yes.
which elaborated a lot, but there didn't seem to be any undercurrent of fear or any undercurrent of what's going on. But when we look at flying saucer lore from 1947 onwards, we've just fought, a horrific world war. We've just, dropped atomic weaponry on, Japan. And even it's interesting, because if you rewind to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, when the world's on the cusp of war, you can already see how scared people are becoming of something perhaps landing from outer space, or from another country, or from whatever, because the reason that panic works so well is because the world was already walking on eggshells. That's why you get the panic of War of the Worlds. If there'd been radio in the late 19th century, there mightn't have been the kind of panic that there was come 1938. But go forward another 9 or 10 years to Arnold's report onwards, so much of it is clearly a reaction to the fear of strange things seen in the skies. It's no longer the joyful fun, we're on the cusp of aviation reports of the Great Airship. It's, hell, we've just fought the first war, which was in many ways influenced more than we could have imagined by aerial technology, whether it's bomb dropping or whether it's, battles fought in the sky, like the Battle of Britain. So there was a very different interpretation of what is strange, and not to mention we were entering the Cold War. So there was a very different interpretation of what a weird object in the sky actually meant. And even though the extraterrestrial hypothesis might have caught on very quickly, I think you can't understand that without understanding those currents of apprehension about when you look skyward and saw something you didn't know. It was very specific to that post World War II time and space, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And see, that's another thing that Vallee brings up in Messengers of Deception, is if you need pro-human propaganda, the best thing is an extraterrestrial threat. And I do wonder how much that played into, like you're saying, like the Cold War era and all of these sightings of extraterrestrials, especially the friendly ones. The friendly Venusians always warning against atomic power and nuclear power. I mean, that was huge in that era as well.
Yeah, you've got to think, even Vallee aside, and I love that book, as I mentioned to you, but even Vallee aside, you have to think, what were there, and we know what some of the intelligence agencies were doing with these reports, whether they were initializing them or whether they were spinning them. It seems clear that they weren't left alone. Like, we know there was a CIA historian, I forgot his name, but he wrote a report which came out in the, I think, mid to late 1990s. I certainly looked at it in my dissertation. He essentially said, well, we knew that a lot of the UFO sightings in the 60s were Americans seeing, high-end aerial technology that we were testing, particularly some of our bombers of the time and the like. But but we spun that because we were happy to spin it that it was extraterrestrial because it provided coverage for what they were actually seeing. And I think a lot of Area 51 is exactly the same. I don't know what they're actually testing in there. I do know. Let me rephrase that. I do know that they're testing state-of-the-art aerial technology in there, which you don't want. You certainly don't want a foreign power to get a handle on what you're doing, but it works so much better if you spin what people are seeing as reverse engineered UFOs flying out of a secret base. So why not let that spin go? And you only have to interject a little bit of spin into there, and the UFO community will do the rest. And this is where it gets particularly scary. And if I was somebody as I used to be who was sure about the ETH, this alone would make me really, and when I say ETH, that means the extraterrestrial hypothesis, people who believe UFOs come from another planet. Have you seen, and before I go into another one of my raving rants, because you might do it better for me, have you seen the documentary Mirage Men?
Yes. It was a few years ago, so it's not fresh in my mind, but yeah, I watched that. And see, that plays it again right into that two-parter from X-Files. Because once you hit, it's almost like the conspiracy within the conspiracy. And suddenly you start wondering which way is up in this. So yes, yeah. That was a trip. When I first was really starting to research UFOs, I hit the Simonton encounter, which is one of my all-time favorites. Of course, it was from Eagle River, Wisconsin. Joe Simonton received pancakes from occupants of a flying saucer. And it's just so weird. So when I was really hardcore into the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and I found out that the pancakes did end up being of earthly materials, of course, naturally, the first thing I thought, oh, well, sure, yeah, they gave them to the government to test. Well, of course they came back earthly. I figured it was some sort of massive breakfast cover-up for these pancakes. But the truth is that I feel like that is a very easy trap to fall into, like you were saying, of just believing in not only the UFOs, but also the government cover-up. That really goes hand in hand. And that does cause something like Mirage Men, or like, again, that double part in X-Files. Now that's fiction, but that causes scenarios like that to become very, very easy to perpetrate. And it just makes all of the information so much more convoluted.
Yeah, I think the pancake UFO guy, Joe Simonton, is that his name? I always forget his name. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was only thinking about that story when I think I might have been reading one of your fantastic pieces, which brought it up, and I was thinking how it's so easy to dismiss that, like you said that it is. But if the phenomenon, and we're talking again about a broader phenomenon across all types of paranormal or Fortean phenomenon, whatever we want to call them, Keelian phenomenon might work just as well. If there's some type of intelligence which isn't human, or something which is even firing us off to see and believe things, then there's going to be a level of almost hilarity to that. There's going to be things which are really funny. And I think it's so easy to take the phenomenon so serious. And listen, incidentally, I think the phenomenon should be to a degree taken seriously. And I think that there's aspects of it which are downright frightening. You can't read Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallee or Mothman Prophecies by John Keel and not be terrified. But at the same time, I think if those guys are right and there's some kind of non-human intelligence or something bigger and which we don't understand, sometimes it's going to be so nonsensical, like UFO pilots giving, a guy in the middle of Wisconsin pancakes, that to us it's going to be almost dismissible. But as John Keel said, it's those weirder reports that we should probably take seriously, because that's, to me, more indicative of some genuine experience with something inhuman than a very straight standard, well, they landed and they said, we come from this star system and all of, these kind of expected science fiction tropes. When you hear a report which is just flat out bizarre, then if you're more comfortable or more sympathetic to an interpretation that there's some broader, stranger thing happening behind everything, it's kind of, in a weird way, it makes sense. Of course it's going to be weird to us and strange and nonsensical and not what we expect. Oh, yeah. And I think it's easy to fall into a trap of expecting the phenomenon to behave in a certain way if you believe in something more physical, and it's easy to ignore those things. And incidentally, most serious UFO investigators from the 40s almost certainly through to Barney and Betty Hill. So if we're looking at NICAP, for example, at the time that was headed by the ex-Marine Donald Kehoe, right? If we look at that, I think Kehoe is a very significant, and I think he was very sincere. But NICAP, under his direction, as most serious UFO investigators at the time, they would dismiss any contact account. Forget about whether it sounded like it fit a reasonable science fiction trope or not. They would just dismiss it out of hand. So they believed there were extraterrestrials visiting this planet, but the second somebody came forward and said, whether it was as strange as, well, the ET gave me pancakes, or whether it was, well, we saw them outside of the craft, and we, said, almost all of those reports were ignored by serious investigators until I think it was the Lorenzens, I think, that wrote the first significant UFO book, who used to run APRO, I think, was there, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. I think it was really, and they were taken as seriously as NICAP. I think the Lorenzens started to say, hang on, there's way too many reports from sincere witnesses. And then that started to crack it around the time of the Betty and Barney Hill for experience as well, which that abduction tended to even change NICAP's mind a little bit. And then they started looking at those kind of encounter reports as well. But I mean, I only bring that up because we were talking about, I suppose, how today people might dismiss other ridiculousness. Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even an encounter with a humanoid was considered ridiculous by most mainstream UFO investigators.
Yeah, that is something that did not hit me at all until I was in Invisible Residence Camp with Sanderson. I didn't realize the struggle that there was to say, okay, we have unidentified flying objects. Sure, we think they're extraterrestrial, but we don't want to talk about, I think there was even a Keel article that was called, Never Mind the Flying Saucer, Did You See Who Was Driving It? And I did not realize the struggle that there was to correlate flying saucers or UFOs with occupants. And in a similar vein, again, and I think this is just another sign of like growing up in different times. Growing up late 90s, early 2000s, cattle mutilations. I just figured everybody always thought that they were connected to UFOs and little green men. And then again, in Messengers of Deception, that was also a struggle to connect, related sightings of anomalous things in the sky to cattle mutilations. So, I mean, it's interesting, too, how beliefs, they appear and they're considered very, very fringe, and all of a sudden, after a few years, it doesn't even take very long. They become ingrained into the culture to the point that, you can be completely unaware of a time when they weren't.
And I think that's one of the dangers of the UFO community behaving in many ways the same way as science does within a paradigm. So accepting a paradigm and then maybe that paradigm cracking and shifting. And we've seen that a number of times since 47. And I think where it kind of coalesced between both communities, between the mainstream scientific community and between the UFO community, and Jacques Vallee, who we've talked about, is the perfect example of this, is when the Condon report came out, the University of Colorado's study on UFOs, when the Air Force was getting sick of all these sightings and when they were under pressure from Congress to do some serious investigation, whether UFOs proved a threat or not, or was kind of fobbed off to the University of Colorado. And after a voluminous report and after quite some time supposedly doing rigorous investigation, the report was, there's nothing here to worry about, essentially. But we know that this is a classic example of science working the way that Thomas Kuhn said it worked, more like any social grouping works, rather than this rigorous thing we can trust, which we're constantly told by the mainstream media, and we're constantly told by people who have absolute faith in science, the way people thousands of years ago had absolute faith in the shaman or the whole high priest or whatever, is that within Condon at the time, there was some struggle between people who thought there was something here that was genuinely strange and they lost, and between people who were more concerned, as the Lowe memo proved, one of the senior I guess advisors or senior staff members of the Condon Report wrote this internal memo that was leaked, which says the trick for us, and the trick is the part which got the headlines, the trick is that we have to present ourselves as investigating UFOs seriously, but we have to almost nod, wink, wink to the scientific community to let them know that we don't take it seriously or we look like buffoons. So people like Alan Hynek at the time and Jacques Vallee were trying to, who were involved with the Condon Report or the University of Colorado investigation initially, and were trying to give them data to, say something genuinely strange is happening here. And this is back in the day where Vallee was still essentially, when you read his early works like Anatomy of a Phenomenon, and there's another one, it's pretty clear he's an ETH guy then. It's pretty clear he thinks it's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But when science failed the UFO, and it failed genuine UFO investigations. There's no doubt. I don't think you can look at that report and look at the history behind the report and say that was an objective scientific report. It wasn't. It clearly wasn't. And when science behaved in that way, Jacques Vallee essentially goes home and takes his toys with him. And he literally throws the ball away, in fact. And you see that in Passport Magonia. Passport to Magonia is a classic, is him almost venting and going, I'm done with the traditional scientific method. Science has failed us. What I do know is that the UFO phenomenon has very clear parallels with what we would think of supernatural or occult or fairy tales from before. And so you see the scientific community shutting down UFOs essentially almost forever, although now you can argue with the Tic-Tac videos, which we see so much of today, and DeLong's foundation, which is taking it seriously and having some heavy hitters involved, that maybe there's some re-injection of science being interested, and the media treating UFOs perhaps as they might be extraterrestrial again. But almost from that point onwards, for a very long time, after Condon said there's nothing here, and Vallee walked away from it and said, well, it's something far more linked to our psyches and far more linked to an older folkloric tradition, there almost is this clear breaking point in the late 60s where I think everybody who was seriously committed to science went one way, and not anybody, but a lot of people who were seriously looking at the UFO phenomenon almost went the other. So I think that's an example of there being a paradigm shift in both science and in the UFO community almost at the same time. And feeding off each other, incidentally.
Oh yeah, and that rift, I do think that it's being bridged slightly, like you were saying, but that ties into so many people believing that that's simply another part of the conspiracy, with all of the UFO shows and the movies, that especially the American public is being groomed to accept it for the inevitable disclosure, which, as you mentioned, has been kind of being teased since the 50s. So yeah, it's definitely, it's all an interesting study.
Having chatted to you today has been just absolutely fascinating, and I don't think we expected to get any closer to the ultimate truth, because I'm not sure what the ultimate truth is, but it was wonderful having you on. I don't know if you have any closing words or you want to add anything else.
Sure. Well, thank you so very much. Thank you for inviting me on. This was a really, like you said, just fascinating discussion. Got to talk about X-Files. That's always a good day. But really, this was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. What a fascinating conversation with Zelia Edgar. Again, I'd really encourage you to check out her podcast and her other work at justanothertinfoilhat.com. Check us out at talkingweird.com, and you can find us on Facebook at Talking Weird Podcast. Of course, make sure to listen in next time when my co-host Jen Durrell will be jumping on the weird train, and we'll be chatting about her many paranormal experiences. And now, from the North Woods, I bid you all a fond farewell. But between now and next time, could you please do me a personal favor? Stay weird.